What if the rituals surrounding death were designed not to comfort, but to control? In the Victorian era, the line between mourning and manipulation blurred. We're diving deep into the disturbing psychology behind their elaborate funeral customs, exposing how grief was weaponized and perception meticulously managed. Are you ready to see the dark underbelly of a seemingly civilized age? Welcome. Settle into comfort. Let the weight of the day ease from your shoulders and prepare to journey into the shadowed parlors of Victorian England. Tonight, we explore an era when death was not whispered about behind closed doors, but instead became the centerpiece of elaborate ritual and careful display. The 19th century carried death differently than we do today. It walked openly through the streets, lingered in every household, and demanded acknowledgement from all levels of society. Infant mortality claimed one child in every 5 before their first birthday. Tuberculosis, cholera, and scarlet fever moved through communities with relentless regularity. The average life expectancy hovered around 40 years. Death was not an abstract concept relegated to hospitals and funeral homes. It happened at home, in bedrooms, witnessed by families who gathered around bedsides in vigil. In this atmosphere of constant mortality, the Victorians developed an intricate psychology around death and mourning. They transformed grief into performance, loss into commerce, and memory into tangible objects you could wear against your skin. Tonight, we examine the darker currents beneath these elaborate rituals, the psychological mechanisms that turned sorrow into spectacle and mourning into manipulation. Imagine yourself in this world where black crepe hung from every doorway of a bereaved household, where the length of your mourning clothes dictated your social standing, where professional mourners wept on command at the graves of strangers. This was an era that claimed to honor death while simultaneously commodifying every aspect of it. Let us begin our exploration in the spaces where death occurred most frequently, in the ordinary homes of ordinary people, where the rituals of dying first took root. The rhythm of life in Victorian England moved to the steady pulse of mortality. You wake in a terraced house in London, the year perhaps 1870, and the sounds filtering through your window carry the familiar markers of death's presence. A muffled bell tolls from the parish church, its cadence slow and measured. 3 rings for a child, 6 for a woman, 9 for a man. You've learned to count them without thinking, the way you might count your own heartbeats. In the room next door, your neighbor's household maintains its vigil. Black crepe has hung from their door for 2 days now, ever since their youngest succumbed to diphtheria. The fabric moves slightly in the morning breeze, a dark flag of sorrow visible to everyone who passes. You've sent over a dish of cold meats and a loaf of bread, as custom dictates. The food will sit largely untouched. The bereaved family follows the strict protocols of mourning, which specify that the first days after death require minimal eating, minimal speaking, maximal suffering. This obsession with death permeated every level of Victorian society, but it emerged from practical necessity before it evolved into elaborate ritual. High mortality rates meant that death visited most households with disturbing frequency. A mother might expect to bury at least 1 child. Husbands prepared for the likelihood of outliving multiple wives who died in childbirth. Infections that we now treat with simple antibiotics proved fatal with grim regularity. The Victorians responded to this constant proximity to death by attempting to control it through ritual. If they could not prevent death, they could at least dictate its presentation, manage its social implications, and transform the chaos of loss into ordered ceremony. This impulse toward control would eventually calcify into something more complex, more psychologically fraught. The concept of a good death dominated Victorian thinking about mortality. A good death occurred at home, surrounded by family, The dying person remained conscious and aware, capable of offering final words of wisdom or forgiveness. They made peace with God, accepted their fate with resignation rather than terror, and slipped away peacefully, preferably in the presence of clergy. This idealized vision of death shaped how families approached the dying process and how society judged those left behind. Consider the typical progression of a Victorian death, beginning with the first recognition of serious illness. When a physician declared an illness terminal, the household shifted into a state of watchful waiting. The sick room became a sacred space, carefully managed according to specific customs. Windows remained slightly open to allow the soul its eventual escape. Mirrors were covered or turned to face the wall, preventing the departing soul from becoming trapped in its own reflection. Clocks in the room were stopped at the moment of death, freezing time at that threshold between life and whatever came after. Family members took turns sitting with the dying person, maintaining constant vigil. This practice served practical purposes. Someone needed to tend to the patient's needs, adjust their position, offer sips of water or laudanum for pain. But it also fulfilled deeper psychological needs. The vigil transformed waiting into active participation, helplessness into duty. Those gathered around the deathbed bore witness, and in bearing witness, they took on roles in a drama that had been performed countless times before. The actual moment of death initiated a carefully choreographed sequence of actions. Someone closed the deceased's eyes and mouth, sometimes placing coins on the eyelids to keep them shut. They straightened the limbs before rigor mortis set in, positioning the body in a peaceful pose. Windows opened wider now, allowing neighbors to see that death had visited this household. The stopped clock remained frozen at that final moment, a temporal marker that separated before from after. Within hours, the household began its transformation into a space of formal mourning. Black crepe appeared on the door, on the windows, draped across mirrors that hadn't already been covered. The crepe served multiple functions. It announced death to the community, preventing awkward social calls. It created a visual barrier between the mourning household and the ordinary world outside. The fabric itself, with its dull, light-absorbing surface, seemed to pull brightness from the air, making rooms dimmer, more somber. The body remained in the home, typically for 3 to 5 days before burial. This period allowed distant relatives to arrive for the funeral, but it also served deeper purposes. The Victorians believed that the boundary between life and death remained permeable for several days. Stories circulated about people who had been declared dead only to revive, sometimes even after being placed in their coffins. The waiting period provided insurance against this horror, though it also meant living with a corpse in close quarters for an extended time. Families arranged the body in the front parlor when possible, or in whichever room could be made most presentable for visitors. They dressed the deceased in their finest clothes, or in a specially made burial shroud. Women's bodies were often arranged with their hands folded over their chest, holding flowers or a prayer book. Men might be positioned with their hands at their sides, suggesting eternal rest. Children were sometimes dressed in white, emphasizing their innocence and purity. The practice of viewing the body became a central ritual during this waiting period. Neighbors, friends, and relatives came to pay their respects, filing past the coffin in the parlor. These visits followed strict etiquette. Visitors spoke in hushed tones, offered condolences in prescribed phrases, and avoided any appearance of levity or inappropriate emotion. The bereaved family received these visitors with careful attention to their own presentation, already beginning the performance of grief that would dominate their lives for months or years to come. But beneath these formal rituals ran darker currents of anxiety. The Victorians feared death intensely, even as they seemed to embrace it through elaborate ceremony. Their fears took specific shapes, manifestations of the era's particular anxieties. They feared dying alone, without witnesses to mark the transition. They feared premature burial, being mistaken for dead and waking in a coffin underground. They feared dying without proper preparation, leaving earthly affairs unsettled or divine judgment uncertain. These fears drove some of the era's strangest practices. Safety coffins were designed with bells or flags that could be activated from inside, just in case someone woke after burial. Bodies were sometimes kept above ground in vaults for extended periods, allowing time for any signs of life to manifest. Physicians developed increasingly elaborate tests for death, checking for breathing with mirrors held to the nose, listening for heartbeats with growing medical sophistication, even pricking the skin to see if it would bleed. The emphasis on a good death created immense psychological pressure on both the dying and their families. A person who died suddenly, without the opportunity for final words or religious preparation, brought shame to their household. Families whose loved ones died raving from fever or screaming in pain struggled with the implications. Did a difficult death suggest divine displeasure? Did it indicate a soul unprepared for judgment? These questions tormented the bereaved, adding spiritual anxiety to their grief. Society judged families partly on how well they managed their deaths. A household that maintained proper vigil, that ensured all rituals were correctly performed, that demonstrated appropriate grief through the right symbols and behaviors, proved its respectability. Conversely, families that appeared to mourn insufficiently or incorrectly faced social censure. This pressure transformed private sorrow into public performance, a dynamic that would intensify as Victorian mourning culture developed its most elaborate forms. The psychology at work here operated on multiple levels. On the surface, Victorian death rituals provided structure during the chaos of loss. They gave the bereaved specific tasks to perform, clear guidelines to follow, defined roles to inhabit. This structure offered genuine comfort to many people, transforming overwhelming grief into manageable steps. But the same rituals also served mechanisms of social control, enforcing conformity through the universal experience of death. The elaborate nature of Victorian death customs also reflected the era's broader anxieties about class and social position. In a society undergoing rapid industrialization, where traditional hierarchies faced new challenges, death provided an opportunity to display wealth and status, the quality of one's coffin, the number of mourners, the expense of the funeral itself. All these elements communicated social standing. This commodification of death would reach its peak in the funeral industry that emerged during this period. But it began here, in these early rituals around the deathbed and the laid-out corpse. Even the physical arrangement of the body carried psychological weight. By positioning the dead in peaceful repose, Victorians attempted to deny death's violence, to soften its harsh reality. The corpse became a sleeping figure, merely resting before some implied awakening. This denial served protective purposes, making death more bearable to contemplate. But it also fostered unrealistic expectations about dying, contributing to the intense fear that surrounded any death that deviated from the peaceful ideal. The presence of the corpse in the home for days created its own psychological complexities. Families lived with their dead in intimate proximity, sleeping in nearby rooms, eating meals while the body lay in state in the next room. This forced intimacy with death served as a kind of acclimatization, a gradual adjustment to the reality of loss. But it also created opportunities for psychological disturbance, particularly when the body began showing signs of decomposition, when the person you loved became increasingly difficult to recognize in the thing lying in the coffin. Children grew up surrounded by these rituals, learning death's choreography from their earliest years. They attended viewings, participated in vigils, wore mourning clothes scaled to their small bodies. This early exposure shaped their psychological relationship with mortality in ways that modern observers find difficult to fully comprehend. Death became normalized through constant exposure. Yet the elaborate rituals also emphasized its terrible significance, creating a complex emotional landscape where death was simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary, familiar and terrifying. The waiting period before burial also reflected Victorian beliefs about the afterlife and the soul's journey. Though Christianity promised resurrection and eternal life, lingering folk beliefs suggested that the soul remained near the body for several days, hovering between worlds. Keeping the body at home allowed the soul to become accustomed to its separation from physical existence, to say its own farewells to familiar spaces and loved ones. This belief added another layer of meaning to the vigil, transforming it from mere waiting into a kind of spiritual midwifery, attending the birth of the soul into its next existence. As gas lighting became more common in Victorian homes, the tradition of keeping candles burning around the corpse took on new significance. The candles connected the present to ancient customs, their flickering light creating an atmosphere distinct from the steady glow of gas lamps. They also served practical purposes, masking odors as the body began to decay. But symbolically, they represented the light of the soul, the divine spark that persisted even as the flesh grew cold. The sounds of the mourning household created their own psychological atmosphere. Hushed voices, muffled footsteps, the rustle of black crepe, the steady tick of clocks in rooms where the death room clock remained stopped. These sounds wove together into a tapestry of suspended time. Laughter became inappropriate, music ceased, even ordinary conversation felt constrained by invisible rules about proper behavior in the presence of death. The scent of flowers dominated these spaces, massive arrangements surrounding the coffin, their heavy perfume attempting to overwhelm the smell of death that grew stronger as days passed. Victorian mourners developed specific preferences for funeral flowers: white lilies for purity, roses for love, rosemary for remembrance. Each bloom carried coded meaning, transforming the floral arrangements into complex messages about the deceased and the family's grief. This entire elaborate system existed in service of attempting to make death comprehensible, manageable, even beautiful in its way. The Victorians couldn't eliminate death, couldn't prevent its constant intrusion into their lives, but they could surround it with ritual that transformed raw mortality into something culturally meaningful. Yet this transformation came at a psychological cost that would become increasingly apparent as Victorian mourning culture reached its most extreme expressions. The foundation established in these early moments after death, the vigil, the viewing, the careful preparation of the body, set the stage for everything that followed. It initiated families into a system of grief management that would control their lives for months or years, that would dictate what they wore, where they went, how they socialized, even how they were permitted to feel. The shadow of grief, once it fell across a Victorian household, did not lift quickly or easily. The transformation of grief into commerce began almost imperceptibly, emerging from genuine community support before calcifying into professional enterprise. By the mid-19th century, death had become one of Victorian England's most profitable industries. A marketplace where sorrow translated directly into pounds and shillings, where the depth of your grief could be measured by the depth of your purse. Imagine yourself standing outside a shop on a London street in 1875, its window dressed entirely in black. No cheerful displays here, no bright fabrics or inviting arrangements. Instead, you see mourning goods arranged with somber dignity. Black-bordered stationery, jet jewelry arranged on black velvet, mourning dresses on mannequins draped in crepe, bottles of hair dye specially formulated to darken clothing to the required shade of black. The shop's sign reads "Mourning Warehouse," and similar establishments have proliferated across every major city, small towns, even rural villages. The funeral industry, as we recognize it today, emerged during the Victorian era, transforming what had been largely family-managed affairs into professional services. Undertakers, previously called upon mainly to provide coffins and transport, expanded their offerings to encompass every aspect of death's management. They became funeral directors, orchestrating elaborate ceremonies that required specialized knowledge of etiquette, access to expensive materials, and coordination of multiple service providers. The typical Victorian funeral began with the family's first visit to the funeral director's establishment. These businesses carefully cultivated atmospheres of hushed respectability, dark wood paneling, heavy curtains, soft carpeting that muffled footsteps, subdued lighting that cast everything in flattering shadow. The physical environment itself communicated seriousness and discretion. The funeral director greeted bereaved families with practiced solemnity, his voice modulated to express sympathy while maintaining professional detachment. The consultation proceeded through a series of decisions, each carrying both practical and symbolic weight. First came selection of the coffin. Funeral directors displayed models ranging from plain pine boxes to elaborate caskets lined with silk and fitted with silver handles. The cheapest options sufficed for pauper funerals, but respectable families understood that the coffin represented their final gift to the deceased, their last opportunity to demonstrate love and respect through material means. Coffin prices varied dramatically. A basic wooden coffin might cost a few pounds, affordable even for working-class families who saved specifically for this purpose. But elaborate caskets could cost hundreds of pounds, their construction involving skilled carpentry, expensive materials, and extensive decoration. Lead-lined coffins, which slowed decomposition, commanded premium prices. Coffins with viewing windows, glass panels allowing mourners to see the deceased's face without opening the lid, represented the height of costly innovation. The funeral director guided families through these choices with subtle pressure. He might point out that a particular coffin seemed insufficient for someone of the deceased's standing, or suggest that other families of similar class typically chose more expensive options. This gentle manipulation exploited grief's vulnerability, the desperate desire to honor the dead properly, the fear of appearing cheap or uncaring. Many families purchased coffins beyond their means, taking on debt to ensure a respectable funeral. Beyond the coffin came decisions about transportation. The funeral carriage industry developed specialized vehicles designed exclusively for death. Horse-drawn hearses became increasingly ornate throughout the Victorian period, featuring black lacquered wood, elaborate carvings, glass panels displaying the coffin, and plumes of black ostrich feathers atop the horses' heads. The number of horses pulling the hearse indicated the deceased's social status. 4 horses for the respectable middle class, 6 for the wealthy, 2 for the poor. Mourning coaches transported the bereaved family, equally elaborate vehicles upholstered in black, their windows curtained to shield the occupants from public view. The procession to the cemetery might include dozens of carriages, a mobile display of the deceased's social connections and the family's ability to mobilize this expensive parade of grief. The horses themselves became part of the funeral industry's spectacle. Suppliers specialized in breeding black horses for funeral work, training them to move at the slow, measured pace appropriate to funeral processions. These animals were fitted with elaborate black plumes and caparisons, transforming them into theatrical elements of mourning. The cost of hiring these horses and their ornate trappings added substantially to funeral expenses. Professional mourners represented another layer of the funeral industry's offerings. These hired grief performers appeared at funerals to augment the mourning party, their tears and lamentations available for purchase. The practice had ancient roots, but Victorians industrialized it, creating agencies that supplied mourners in various categories. Mutes stood at the door of the deceased's house and at the cemetery gates, silent figures dressed entirely in black, their presence lending gravity to the proceedings. They held staffs wrapped in black crepe and maintained expressions of studied sorrow. The number of mutes at a funeral signaled its importance. Wealthy families might employ a dozen or more, while modest funerals made do with 2 or 3. Female mourners, often called weepers, provided vocal lamentation. They dressed in heavy black veils and positioned themselves prominently during the funeral service, weeping loudly at appropriate moments. Skilled weepers could produce tears on command, their performances ranging from quiet sobbing to dramatic wailing, depending on what the family requested. They understood the theatrical beats of a funeral service, knowing precisely when to intensify their grief and when to allow it to subside into dignified sniffling. The existence of professional mourners reveals the performative nature of Victorian grief. Families hired these strangers to demonstrate emotions that presumably the actual relatives should have felt. But the logic operated differently. Professional mourners amplified the family's genuine sorrow, made it publicly visible, ensured that the funeral achieved the proper emotional register. They transformed private feeling into public spectacle, grief into theatre. The cost of professional mourners varied based on their skill and the duration of their services. A single mute might cost a few shillings for an afternoon's work. Accomplished weepers commanded higher fees, particularly those with reputations for convincing performances. Some families employed professional mourners not only for the funeral itself, but for the entire mourning period, having them appear at the house during viewing hours to enhance the atmosphere of sorrow. Mourning attire constituted perhaps the most visible and expensive aspect of Victorian grief culture. The elaborate dress codes surrounding mourning generated enormous profits for textile manufacturers, dressmakers, and retailers of mourning goods. These codes operated with the precision of law, dictating exactly what should be worn, for how long, and under what circumstances. Women bore the heaviest burden of mourning dress. A widow entered full mourning, also called first mourning, immediately upon her husband's death. This phase required her to wear exclusively dull black fabric, with no ornamentation beyond jet jewelry. Her dresses featured high necklines, long sleeves, and voluminous skirts. She covered her head and face with a heavy black veil made of crepe, the fabric's dull surface absorbing light and obscuring her features. This veil, known as a widow's cap, extended past her waist, creating a cocoon of black that isolated her from the visual world. The fabrics specified for mourning dress possessed particular characteristics. Crepe, especially bombazine, dominated early mourning wardrobes. This material had a crimped, crinkled texture and an absolutely matte finish that caught no light, creating a void-like blackness. Bombazine combined silk and worsted wool in a way that produced this distinctive, dull surface. It was also notably uncomfortable. Hot, heavy, scratchy against the skin, rustling loudly with every movement. Full mourning for a widow lasted a minimum of 1 year and a day, though many women extended it to 2 years or longer. During this period, she withdrew almost entirely from social life. She could not attend parties, theaters, or most social gatherings. She avoided brightly lit places, music, laughter. Her life contracted to home, church, and cemetery visits. The black dress she wore became a kind of portable isolation chamber, marking her as socially untouchable, a living memorial to her dead husband. After full mourning came second mourning, lasting another 9 to 12 months. The widow could now wear fabrics with slight sheen, silk, though still black. She could incorporate white collar and cuffs into her dress. Her veil shortened, no longer completely obscuring her face. She could venture more freely into society, though still avoiding frivolous entertainments. Third mourning, or half mourning, allowed the introduction of colors: grey, lavender, mauve, white. This phase lasted another 3 to 6 months, gradually transitioning the widow back toward normal dress and normal life. Even then, she might choose to wear mourning colors permanently, identifying herself perpetually as a widow, her clothing a lifetime monument to loss. The expense of maintaining this wardrobe proved ruinous for many families. A complete mourning wardrobe for a widow might include a dozen or more dresses, each serving specific functions: house dresses, street dresses, visiting dresses, all in the appropriate fabrics for her mourning stage. Undergarments, stockings, shoes, gloves, handkerchiefs, all required black versions. The cost could easily exceed a year's income for a working-class family. Retailers of mourning goods understood their captive market. Shops specializing in mourning wear stocked every conceivable item in black: parasols, fans, writing implements, household linens, even black-edged plates and serving pieces for families who wish to extend mourning symbolism to their tables. These businesses thrived on grief, their profits rising and falling with the death rate. The rapid pace of fashion created additional pressures. Even within mourning dress, styles evolved, and fashion-conscious women felt obligated to maintain current silhouettes even while restricting themselves to mourning colors. This meant purchasing new mourning clothes multiple times during the extended mourning period, as hemlines rose or fell, as sleeve shapes changed, as bodice construction evolved. Men's mourning dress, though less elaborate, still required significant expenditure. Men wore black suits with black crepe armbands during full mourning. Their hats, gloves, even their walking sticks featured black elements. Though men's mourning periods ran shorter than women's, typically 3 to 6 months for a wife, 6 to 12 months for a parent, they still faced pressure to maintain appropriate appearances through quality mourning clothes. Children's mourning clothes represented another profit center. Victorian society expected even infants to wear mourning for deceased parents or siblings. Manufacturers produced miniature versions of adult mourning attire, scaled to fit small bodies but equally expensive relative to family income. A child might wear mourning dress multiple times during their youth, as aunts, uncles, grandparents, and siblings passed away. The practice of dyeing existing clothes, black emerged as one solution to mourning dress expenses. Families sent their ordinary clothes to professional dyers who transformed them into mourning-appropriate garments. But the results were often imperfect. Blues and greens might achieve acceptable blackness, but reds and yellows resisted transformation, producing muddy browns or uneven tones. Truly respectable families avoided dyed garments, purchasing new mourning clothes from proper mourning warehouses. Jet jewelry became another significant element of the mourning economy. Jet, a form of fossilized wood that polishes to deep black with a slight sheen, was carved into rings, brooches, earrings, bracelets, and necklaces. Victorian women wore jet jewelry during all phases of mourning, its darkness appropriate to grief, while its subtle luster prevented it from appearing too dreary. The town of Whitby in Yorkshire became the centre of British jet production, its workshops employing hundreds of craftsmen carving mourning jewellery. The popularity of jet created shortages and drove up prices, leading to the development of substitutes. Vulcanite, a hardened rubber that could be dyed deep black, provided a cheaper alternative. Glass and gutta percha also served as jet imitations. But discerning mourners insisted on genuine jet, its higher cost signalling both their taste and their financial resources. Beyond clothing and jewelry, mourning stationery constituted another necessary purchase. Letters written during mourning required black bordered paper, the width of the black border corresponding to the depth of mourning. A widow in first mourning used paper with borders a full inch wide. As mourning lightened, the borders narrowed. Even visiting cards, calling cards, and business correspondence required mourning borders when sent by bereaved individuals. Printers specialized in mourning stationery maintained extensive inventories of black-bordered papers in various qualities and border widths. They also offered custom printing services for memorial cards, funeral announcements, and acknowledgement cards, thanked those who sent condolences or attended the funeral. These cards themselves became collectible items. many Victorians maintaining albums of memorial cards from funerals they attended. The embalming industry emerged during this period, though it developed more slowly in Britain than in America. Embalming allowed bodies to be kept above ground for longer periods without noticeable decomposition, extending the viewing period and allowing time for distant relatives to arrive. The process involved draining blood and replacing it with preservative chemicals, a procedure that required specialized knowledge and equipment. Embalmers advertised their services as a way to preserve the deceased's appearance, to maintain the illusion of peaceful sleep rather than death's decay. For wealthy families who could afford the expense, embalming became another expected element of proper funeral management. The practice also benefited funeral directors, who could schedule funerals more flexibly when decomposition ceased to be an urgent concern. Hair art represented one of the era's most curious mourning industries. Jewelry and decorative objects made from human hair had existed for centuries, but Victorians elevated the practice to new levels of elaboration and commercial production. Bereaved families saved hair from their dead, either cutting it from the corpse or collecting hair from brushes and combs the deceased had used in life. This hair was transformed into jewelry, framed pictures, watch chains, wreaths and other keepsakes. Professional hair artists wove, braided and arranged hair into intricate patterns and images. A single piece might incorporate hair from multiple family members, creating a tangible genealogy of loss. Rings contained woven hair under glass. Brooches featured elaborate hair work forming flowers or geometric designs. Framed pictures displayed hair arranged into weeping willows or memorial urns. The hair art industry operated through specialized shops and mail-order services. Families sent their saved hair to these businesses, selecting from catalogs of available designs. Prices varied based on complexity. A simple hair bracelet might cost a few shillings, while an elaborate framed piece could cost several pounds. Some hair artists achieved fame for their work, their creations treasured as both memorial objects and artistic achievements. The psychological implications of wearing dead people's hair, of decorating homes with wreaths made from corpses' locks, revealed the Victorian relationship with death's physical remnants. These objects kept the dead literally present, touchable, visible in daily life. They transformed human remains into precious materials worthy of preservation and display. They also created a market for grief, turning the intimate materials of the body into commodities. Mourning warehouses, funeral directors, professional mourners, clothing manufacturers, jewelers, hair artists, embalmers. All these industries thrived on death, their prosperity built on loss. The cumulative cost of a respectable Victorian funeral and the mourning period that followed could easily exceed a year's income for a middle-class family, pushing working-class families into debt that might take years to repay. Burial societies and funeral insurance schemes emerged partly in response to these crushing expenses. Working people paid small weekly premiums into collective funds that would cover funeral costs when death occurred. These societies ensured that even the poor could afford a basic level of funeral respectability, avoiding the shame of a pauper's burial. But the existence of these schemes also normalized the expectation that substantial sums must be spent on death, that anything less represented failure. The funeral industry's marketing operated through subtle social pressure rather than aggressive advertising. Funeral directors presented themselves as counselors, guiding families through difficult times, not salesmen pushing expensive products. But their guidance consistently steered customers toward more elaborate, more expensive options. They understood that grief created vulnerability, that bereaved families would agree to purchases they might later regret, driven by the desperate need to honor their dead properly and the fear of social judgment. This transformation of mourning into commerce, grief into profit, created a system where authentic sorrow became impossible to disentangle from its commercial performance. The black dress, the elaborate funeral, the professional mourners, the hair jewelry, all these elements simultaneously expressed genuine grief and demonstrated the family's financial capacity to mourn correctly. Sorrow and status became inseparable, each validating the other. The poor suffered most under this system. They felt the same griefs as the wealthy, but lacked resources to express it through approved channels. A working-class widow might own only one black dress, wearing it through all phases of mourning, unable to afford the gradual lightening of fabrics and colors that proper mourning required. Her single dress announced not only her grief, but her poverty, the two conditions merging into a visible marker of social position. Some families bankrupted themselves, attempting to maintain mourning standards beyond their means. They purchased elaborate coffins on credit, hired carriages they couldn't afford, dressed in mourning clothes that left them unable to pay rent or buy food. The social pressure to mourn correctly proved so intense that financial ruin seemed preferable to the shame of inadequate mourning. The funeral industry also employed fear as a marketing tool. Advertisements and advice literature warned about the dangers of improper burial preparation, the horror of bodies that decayed too quickly, the social disgrace of funerals that fell short of community standards. These messages cultivated anxiety that could only be resolved through purchasing the industry's services and products. By the late Victorian period, the commodification of grief had become so complete that genuine mourning became difficult to recognize. When every aspect of sorrow could be purchased, when professional mourners wept for pay and black crepe could be bought by the yard, how could observers distinguish authentic grief from its purchased simulation? The market had colonized death so thoroughly that emotion itself became suspect, potentially just another performance in the elaborate theater of Victorian mourning. Yet people continued to grieve genuinely, their hearts breaking regardless of the commercial apparatus surrounding their loss. The black dress might be purchased, but the tears that fell on it were real. The professional mourners might be hired, but the family's pain needed no rehearsal. The Victorian funeral industry built its profits on authentic suffering, exploiting real grief while simultaneously claiming to honor and express it. This paradox defined the macabre economy of Victorian mourning, an industry that grew wealthy from sorrow while insisting it served grief's genuine needs, that transformed the most intimate human experiences into marketable commodities, while maintaining the fiction that these transactions somehow elevated and dignified death itself. The transformation of private sorrow into public spectacle reached its fullest expression in the elaborate performances of Victorian mourning. Grief became something to be displayed, measured, and judged according to exacting standards that left little room for authentic emotional experience. The Victorians constructed an entire system of behavioral codes around mourning, dictating not only what the bereaved wore, but how they moved through the world, whom they could see, what activities they could pursue, even what emotions they were permitted to express, and when. Imagine yourself as a Victorian widow, standing before your mirror on the morning after your husband's funeral. The woman reflected back at you appears as a stranger, wrapped entirely in black crepe that rustles with every movement. The heavy veil obscures your features, transforming your face into a dark shadow. You have become a walking monument to death, your individuality subsumed into the role of mourner. For the next year at minimum, possibly 2 or more, this darkened figure will be your only public identity. The rules governing mourning behavior operated with the precision of choreography, each gesture and action prescribed by social convention. These rules varied based on your relationship to the deceased, your gender, your social class, even your age. But they all shared a common purpose: to make grief visible, legible, subject to community observation and judgment. Women bore the primary burden of mourning performance. Society expected them to embody grief through their entire being, to transform themselves into living memorials. The widow's role demanded the most extensive and rigorous mourning, but women mourned for parents, siblings, children, even more distant relatives, according to carefully graduated scales of obligation. During first mourning, the widow's world contracted to its smallest circumference. She could not attend any social gatherings beyond the most somber. Parties, balls, theatres, concerts, all these pleasures vanished from her life. She could venture out for church services, cemetery visits, and essential shopping, but even these excursions required her to maintain a demeanour of profound sorrow. Laughter became inappropriate, smiles suspect. She must move through public spaces with downcast eyes, measured steps, an aura of dignified suffering. The practice of calling, social visits that formed the backbone of middle and upper-class Victorian social life, ceased almost entirely during full mourning. A widow in deep mourning did not make calls, nor did she receive casual visitors. Only close family could visit, and these visits took place in dimly lit rooms, conversations conducted in hushed tones, the atmosphere carefully maintained at a pitch of appropriate solemnity. Even correspondence operated under mourning restrictions. Letters written during mourning periods required black-bordered stationery, the width of the border signaling the depth of grief. A widow used the widest borders, her very writing paper announcing her loss to every recipient. The content of these letters also faced scrutiny. A mourning woman should not write cheerfully about pleasant topics, should not express enthusiasm or joy. Her letters, like her person, must reflect constant awareness of her bereaved state. The gradual lightening of mourning restrictions followed a precise timetable. After 12 months of full mourning, the widow entered second mourning. Her dresses could now incorporate slight ornamentation, perhaps jet beading or black ribbons. Her veil shortened, no longer completely obscuring her face. She could resume limited social activities, small gatherings of close friends, quiet dinners, subdued entertainments. But anything approaching gaiety remained forbidden. She existed in a halfway state, no longer utterly withdrawn, but not yet fully returned to normal society. The transition to half-mourning brought the introduction of colour, though only the most subdued shades: grey, lavender, mauve, white. These colours signalled mourning's gradual release while maintaining visual connection to grief. A woman might wear a lavender dress with black trim, or grey with white accents, each colour combination precisely calibrated to communicate her position in the mourning timeline. Even in half-mourning, restrictions persisted. She still avoided frivolous entertainments, still maintained a more reserved demeanour than her pre-bereaved self. The entire process, from death to the resumption of normal dress and behaviour, could consume 2.5 to 3 years for a widow. Other relationships demanded shorter but still substantial mourning periods. A woman mourned her parents for 12 months, her siblings for 6 months, her grandparents for 3 to 6 months, depending on their closeness and her family's customs. Each period required its own wardrobe, its own behavioral restrictions, its own performance of appropriate grief. Men's mourning periods ran significantly shorter, reflecting Victorian gender roles and the expectation that male life should continue relatively uninterrupted by grief. A widower typically mourned for 3 to 6 months, and even during this period, he could continue his professional activities, attend to business, and maintain a relatively normal social presence. His mourning expressed itself primarily through clothing, the black suit, the black armband, the subdued colors, rather than through wholesale withdrawal from public life. This disparity in mourning expectations reveals the deeper psychology at work in Victorian grief culture. Women, associated with emotion and domestic life, were expected to embody grief completely, to make mourning their entire existence. Men, associated with reason and public life, could acknowledge grief while continuing to function in the world. The asymmetry reinforced gender hierarchies while simultaneously placing crushing emotional burdens on women who must perform elaborate grief while managing their own genuine suffering. Children presented particular challenges to mourning's rigid codes. Victorian society expected even young children to wear mourning for deceased parents or siblings, but recognized that children could not maintain the behavioral restrictions demanded of adults. A child might wear a black dress or armband while continuing to play, to laugh, to engage in activities that would be scandalous for an adult mourner. Yet even children's mourning served symbolic purposes, marking the entire family as touched by death, making grief visible across all generations. The public nature of Victorian mourning transformed every bereaved person into a spectacle. The black clothes announced loss to everyone you encountered. Strangers on the street could read your grief in your garments, could judge whether your mourning seemed appropriate to your presumed relationship to the deceased. This visibility created constant awareness of being observed, evaluated, potentially criticized for insufficient or excessive displays of sorrow. Society developed elaborate frameworks for judging mourning performances. A widow who seemed too cheerful too soon faced harsh censure. Gossip circulated about women who abandoned mourning prematurely, who wore inappropriate colors or attended unsuitable entertainments while theoretically in grief. These judgments could have real social consequences: invitations withdrawn, relationships damaged, reputations tarnished. The pressure to mourn correctly became a form of social control, enforcing conformity through the universal experience of loss. But the opposite extreme also drew criticism. A widow who mourned too long, who seemed unable to resume normal life after the prescribed periods elapsed, might be judged as wallowing in grief, as indulging in excessive emotion. The system demanded grief that was visible but controlled, profound but time-limited, genuine but performed according to specific rules. This impossible balance left many women struggling to navigate between insufficient and excessive mourning, their authentic feelings constantly measured against external standards. The practice of sequestering mourners, particularly widows, had roots in various cultural and religious traditions, but Victorians transformed it into an elaborate social ritual. During the deepest mourning period, a widow lived in semi-isolation. Her contact with the outside world filtered through layers of custom and restriction. This isolation served multiple purposes. It protected her from the potentially corrupting influences of normal society. It allowed her time to grieve without the demands of social performance, but it also marked her as fundamentally changed, as someone who had crossed a threshold and could not immediately return. The psychological effects of this enforced isolation varied widely. Some women found genuine comfort in the structured withdrawal, appreciating the permission to step back from social obligations while processing their grief. The black dress and the restricted activities created a protected space where they could mourn without pretense, where tears were expected rather than shameful, where sadness required no explanation or justification. But for others, the isolation intensified suffering. Cut off from friends, from activities that might have provided distraction or comfort, trapped in dark clothes in darkened rooms, some widows descended into deep depression. The mourning system that claimed to honor and support grief instead became a prison, its rigid rules preventing the very healing they supposedly facilitated. Women in this position had no recourse. To resist the mourning codes meant social suicide, but to obey them meant enduring months or years of mandated misery. The theatricality of Victorian mourning extended beyond clothing and behavior to encompass entire domestic spaces. When death visited a household, the home itself entered mourning. Mirrors were covered with black fabric or turned to face walls. Curtains drawn, blocking natural light and creating perpetual twilight. Clocks stopped at the moment of death, freezing time at that transition point. These physical alterations transformed familiar spaces into stages set for grief's performance. The covered mirrors served multiple purposes. Folk belief held that mirrors could trap departing souls, preventing their journey to the afterlife. Covering them protected both the soul and the living from this spiritual danger. But the covered mirrors also served psychological functions, preventing mourners from seeing their own reflections, from confronting the visual evidence of their grief-stricken faces. The absence of mirrors created a space where appearance ceased to matter, where the usual work of self-presentation could be temporarily abandoned. The perpetual dimness of mourning households affected everyone who lived in these spaces. Days passed in twilight, the usual rhythms of light and dark disrupted. This artificial atmosphere reinforced the sense of existing outside normal time, in a suspended state where ordinary rules and patterns no longer applied. Children growing up in these darkened homes absorbed lessons about death's power to transform entire environments, to cast shadows that persisted long after the funeral ended. Public mourning created opportunities for both genuine connection and hollow performance. When a widow encountered another person in mourning on the street, a shared understanding passed between them. The black dresses announced their membership in the community of the bereaved, creating instant recognition and sympathy. These encounters could provide real comfort, moments of connection with others who understood grief's weight. But the same visibility also enabled performative grief divorced from authentic feeling. Some people embraced mourning's theatre, using it to draw attention, to elicit sympathy, to occupy a socially sanctioned dramatic role. The elaborate mourning system made it possible to perform grief convincingly while feeling little, to wear sorrow like a costume while remaining emotionally untouched. This possibility troubled Victorian observers who worried about the relationship between outward display and inner truth. The question of authenticity haunted Victorian mourning culture. How could observers distinguish genuine grief from its performance when the same gestures and garments expressed both? The elaborate codes meant that everyone, regardless of their actual feelings, could mourn correctly simply by following the rules. This democratization of grief's expression served equalizing purposes. Even the emotionally reserved could demonstrate appropriate sorrow through proper dress and behavior. But it also created opportunities for deception, for the appearance of grief without its substance. Letters and diaries from the period reveal the strain of maintaining mourning performances over extended periods. Women wrote about the exhaustion of constant grief display, the difficulty of sustaining appropriate solemnity month after month, the relief of finally emerging from mourning's restrictions. They described feeling trapped by the very system that claimed to honor their loss, imprisoned by clothes and customs that announced their suffering to the world, while sometimes making that suffering worse. But permanent mourning also raised questions about the boundary between honoring the dead and refusing to continue living. Women who mourned indefinitely removed themselves from normal social circulation, from possibilities of remarriage, from full participation in life. They became living monuments to their dead husbands, their entire identities subsumed into the role of widow. Society celebrated this sacrifice while simultaneously finding it somewhat unsettling, evidence of grief that exceeded proper boundaries. The rules governing remarriage for widows operated with particular complexity. A widow who remarried too quickly faced severe social censure. She appeared insufficiently devoted to her first husband's memory, perhaps even suspiciously eager to replace him. Custom suggested waiting at least 2 years before considering remarriage, and many widows waited longer. But a widow who never remarried also attracted attention and sometimes pity, particularly if she was young. She had fulfilled her mourning obligations but chosen to remain in a liminal state, neither fully grieving nor fully living. Men faced different remarriage pressures. Widowers could remarry much more quickly without social censure, sometimes within months of their wives' deaths. Society recognized that men required wives to manage their households and care for their children. A widower's remarriage represented practical necessity rather than betrayal of his first wife's memory. This double standard revealed the different meanings assigned to marriage and grief for men and women. The elaborate mourning system also created opportunities for rebellion and resistance, though often in subtle forms. Some women wore the required mourning clothes but maintained private journals filled with anger, resentment, or relief at their husbands' deaths. The black dress announced appropriate grief while concealing more complex emotional realities. Other women shortened their mourning period slightly, testing the boundaries of acceptable behavior, gradually pushing against the system's constraints. Fashion provided one avenue for expressing individuality within mourning's restrictions. Even while wearing black, women could choose styles that flattered their figures, fabrics that felt pleasant against their skin, accessories that reflected their taste. The jet jewelry industry thrived, partly because it allowed mourning women to ornament themselves while remaining within mourning's color restrictions. A carefully chosen jet brooch or earrings could express personal style while demonstrating proper grief. The transition out of mourning marked a significant psychological threshold. The day a widow could finally discard her black dress and resume wearing colors represented liberation from months or years of restriction. Women described this transition with relief, joy, a sense of emerging from darkness into light. The colored dress announced to the world that mourning had ended, that normal life could resume, that grief's performance no longer governed every aspect of existence. But the ending of formal mourning did not necessarily mean the ending of grief. Many women continued to feel sorrow for lost husbands long after they resumed wearing colors and attending social events. The mourning system's rigid timeline created disjunctions between outward performance and inner experience. You might still grieve deeply while wearing lavender and attending dinner parties, or you might have emotionally moved on while still trapped in mourning's black cocoon. This gap between performance and feeling created its own psychological burdens. Women sometimes felt guilty for grieving less than their elaborate mourning suggested, as if the black dress promised more sorrow than they actually experienced. Others resented the system for forcing them to pretend they had recovered when they remained devastated, the colored dress announcing a healing that hadn't occurred. The communal nature of mourning created both support and pressure. Friends and family could provide genuine comfort, practical assistance, emotional sustenance during grief's darkest periods. But the same community also enforced mourning's rules, watching for deviations, criticizing infractions, maintaining the system through social surveillance. Every mourner existed under observation, their grief both private experience and public performance. Children absorbed lessons about grief by watching adult mourning performances. They learned that death required specific responses, specific clothes, specific behaviors. They learned that sorrow must be displayed as well as felt, that private grief required public validation. These lessons shaped their own eventual mourning practices, perpetuating the system across generations. The psychological manipulation inherent in Victorian mourning operated on multiple levels simultaneously. It offered genuine structure and support to some bereaved individuals, while imprisoning others in unwanted restrictions. It honored the dead, while creating opportunities for social posturing and empty performance. It acknowledged grief's reality while dictating its acceptable expressions. The system's complexity meant that it could serve both authentic and manipulative purposes, sometimes in the same mourning performance. The Victorian mourning system ultimately reflected the era's broader anxieties about emotion, authenticity, and social control. By codifying grief, by transforming it into a set of observable behaviors and material displays, Victorians attempted to make the most chaotic and individual of human experiences predictable, manageable, subject to social regulation. They succeeded in creating an elaborate theatre of mourning, but at the cost of sometimes obscuring, constraining, or even intensifying the genuine suffering they claimed to honor. The Victorian impulse to preserve and memorialize the dead found its most unsettling expression in the practice of post-mortem photography and the creation of elaborate keepsakes from human remains. These customs, which strike modern sensibilities as macabre or even disturbing, represented the era's attempt to hold on to the departed, to freeze death's moment in images and objects that could be touched, viewed, and treasured. In these practices, we see the Victorian relationship with death at its most intimate and psychologically complex. Imagine yourself in a photographer's studio in 1880s London, though the scene unfolds not in the studio itself, but in someone's front parlor. The photographer has brought his equipment to the home, a common practice for post-mortem sessions. Heavy cameras on tripods, glass plates, chemical solutions in bottles, all the technical apparatus of early photography arranged around a coffin where a child lies dressed in white. The family gathers, positioning themselves around their dead daughter for a final portrait, a last chance to create an image that will preserve her presence. Post-mortem photography emerged in the 1840s, shortly after photography itself became commercially viable. The daguerreotype process, though expensive, offered something revolutionary, the ability to capture permanent images of people and places. For families who had never owned portraits of their loved ones, death sometimes provided the first and only opportunity to create such a record. The dead, unlike the living, remained perfectly still during the long exposure times early photography required. The earliest post-mortem photographs showed corpses clearly as corpses. Bodies were photographed in their coffins, surrounded by flowers, hands folded across their chests. These images made no attempt to disguise death. They represented memento mori in their purest form, reminders of mortality, permanent records of the dead in their final repose. Families commissioned these photographs to preserve the memory of the deceased's appearance, to have something tangible to hold and study after burial had placed their loved one beyond reach. As photographic techniques improved and exposure times shortened, post-mortem photography evolved toward more elaborate stagings. Photographers began positioning corpses to appear alive or sleeping rather than dead. They propped bodies in chairs, posed them standing with hidden supports, arranged them in tableau with living family members. The goal shifted from documenting death to denying it, creating images where the deceased appeared to be merely resting or sitting quietly with their relatives. Children featured prominently in post-mortem photography, reflecting the era's devastating child mortality rates. Parents who had lost infants or young children commissioned photographs that showed their dead offspring in various poses. An infant might be photographed in its mother's arms, the mother's expression carefully composed while she held her dead child. Older children were posed in chairs or beds, sometimes with toys, sometimes with siblings standing nearby. These images attempted to capture something of the child's living presence, to create a memorial that suggested life rather than death. The technical challenges of post-mortem photography required specialized knowledge. Bodies had to be positioned carefully, often with hidden supports and props to maintain poses. Eyes were sometimes painted onto closed eyelids to create the illusion of wakefulness. Makeup concealed the pallor of death, rouge applied to grey cheeks, the corpse transformed through cosmetic means into a sleeping figure. The photographer worked quickly, aware that decomposition progressed steadily, and that the window for creating a convincing image narrowed with each passing hour. Some post-mortem photographs achieved genuinely unsettling results. In images where corpses were posed with living family members, the dead sometimes appeared more substantial than the living. Because the corpse remained perfectly still during the long exposure, it appeared sharp and clear in the final image. Living subjects, unable to maintain absolute stillness, sometimes appeared slightly blurred or ghostly. This technical quirk created photographs where the dead looked more real than the living, an eerie inversion that troubled many viewers. The practice of post-mortem photography reached its peak in the mid-Victorian period, roughly the 1860s through 1880s. During these decades, photographic studios routinely offered post-mortem services. Photographers advertised their ability to create tasteful memorial images, their sensitivity to bereaved families' needs. Some photographers specialized in post-mortem work, developing particular expertise in posing bodies and creating convincing images of peaceful rest rather than death. The psychological impact of these photographs on both the subjects posing with corpses and the viewers, who later looked at the images, remains difficult to fully assess. For families, the photography session represented both an ordeal and an opportunity. They had to spend extended time with their dead loved one in artificial poses, participating in an elaborate fiction of continued presence. The session forced intimate contact with the corpse at a moment when grief was already overwhelming. Yet it also provided something tangible, a permanent image that would preserve the deceased's appearance after burial and eventual decomposition. Children who posed with dead siblings absorbed complex messages about death through these photography sessions. They learned that death required elaborate performance, that corpses could be treated as if still alive, that the boundary between life and death could be temporarily obscured through careful staging. These experiences shaped their understanding of mortality and their eventual relationship with death when it touched their own adult lives. The distribution of post-mortem photographs followed specific customs. Images were copied and sent to relatives who lived too far away to attend the funeral. They were displayed in homes, often in prominent locations, not hidden away, but shown alongside images of living family members. The presence of these death portraits in everyday living spaces normalized death's visual representation, making the dead literally visible parts of domestic life. Memorial cards, which often featured post-mortem photographs, or at least images of the deceased, circulated widely in Victorian social networks. When someone died, families distributed these cards to friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. Recipients collected them, storing them in albums alongside calling cards and other social memorabilia. A well-maintained card album might contain dozens of memorial cards, a gallery of community death spanning years or decades. The keepsakes made from human remains represented another Victorian practice that modern sensibilities find deeply unsettling. Hair art, which we encountered earlier in the context of the mourning industry, extended beyond jewelry to include elaborate framed pictures, wreaths, and decorative objects. But hair represented only one material harvested from the dead. Victorian keepsake culture also encompassed jewelry containing baby teeth, watch chains woven from hair combined with extracted teeth, even more unusual objects. The practice of keeping human remains as memorial objects had ancient precedents. Religious relics, pieces of saints' bodies preserved and venerated, established the concept that physical remains could carry spiritual significance. The Victorian secularization of this practice transformed religious veneration into domestic sentimentality, but the underlying psychology remained similar. Physical remains could serve as conduits to the departed, tangible connections to those who had passed beyond reach. Hair possessed particular significance in Victorian memorial culture. It was the only part of the body that could be harvested without desecration, that continued to appear vital and living even after death. Hair from the corpse looked identical to hair from the living person, creating an uncanny sense of continuity, It also resisted decay, remaining unchanged for years or decades, effectively immortal even as the body from which it came returned to dust. The process of creating hair jewelry and art involved intricate technical work. Hair had to be cleaned, sorted, and prepared before it could be woven or arranged. Fine hair was braided into chains or cords. Thicker hair was shaped into flowers, leaves, or other decorative elements. Multiple people's hair might be combined in a single piece, creating family genealogies in woven strands. The resulting objects possessed an eerie beauty, their craftsmanship undeniable even as their materials disturbed. Women primarily created hair art, though professional hair artists also existed. The work required patience, fine motor skills, and emotional fortitude. Handling the hair of dead loved ones, manipulating it into decorative forms, demanded a particular psychological orientation toward death and remains. The women who created these objects navigated between grief and craft, transforming mourning into productive activity, loss into creative expression. The wearing of jewelry made from dead people's hair created intimate daily contact with human remains. A bracelet woven from a dead child's hair rested against a mother's wrist, moving with her movements, warming from her body heat. A brooch containing a father's hair pinned to a daughter's dress kept him literally present against her heart. These objects collapsed the distance between living and dead, making the departed's physical presence a constant element of daily life. The psychological implications of this constant contact with human remains operated on multiple levels. For some people, these objects provided genuine comfort, tangible connections to lost loved ones that eased the pain of separation. The hair bracelet or tooth pendant served as transitional objects, helping mourners adjust to absence by maintaining symbolic presence. They could touch the jewelry, hold it, know that they carried part of their loved one with them always. But for others, these objects created disturbing reminders of mortality and decay. The knowledge that the beautiful woven bracelet was made from a corpse's hair, that the pendant contained teeth extracted from a dead mouth, could provoke revulsion even while social convention required wearing these items. The forced intimacy with human remains sometimes intensified grief rather than soothing it, making the dead's absence more painful through these inadequate substitutes for actual presence. The practice of creating plaster death masks represented another form of post-mortem memorialization. Immediately after death, while the face still retained its living shape, plaster was applied to create a mold. Once the plaster hardened and was removed, it preserved an exact impression of the deceased's features. These masks could be displayed directly or used to create more permanent bronze or marble castings. Death masks served both artistic and memorial purposes. They provided precise records of the deceased's appearance, more accurate than any portrait or photograph. Artists used death masks to create funerary sculptures and memorial portraits. Families displayed them in homes, these pale faces frozen in death's final expression. The uncanny quality of death masks, simultaneously familiar and alien, recognizably the person yet fundamentally changed, created powerful emotional responses in viewers. Some Victorian families went further, creating full-body casts of deceased children. These three-dimensional replicas, painted to resemble life and dressed in actual children's clothes, existed in an unsettling territory between doll, sculpture, and corpse. They represented the extreme end of the Victorian impulse to preserve and memorialize, the desperate attempt to deny death's finality by creating permanent simulacra of the departed. The keeping of locks of hair in lockets or small containers represented a more restrained version of hair art. Nearly every Victorian family maintained collections of hair from various relatives, living and dead. These locks were carefully labeled and stored, creating archives of familial connection that spanned generations. When someone died, their hair was added to the collection. their strand joining the accumulated strands of ancestors and relatives. Mourning rings, which often contained hair or other remains, were distributed to close friends and family after funerals. These rings announced the wearer's connection to the deceased and their participation in mourning. They also served as permanent reminders of mortality, small tokens of death carried on living hands. The tradition had ancient roots, but reached new elaboration during the Victorian period, with rings designed specifically as memorial objects, inscribed with names and dates, sometimes containing miniature portraits alongside the hair. This practice also reflected Victorian anxieties about being forgotten after death. By creating elaborate memorial objects, by distributing keepsakes widely among friends and family, people attempted to ensure their memory would persist beyond their lifetime. The hair jewelry, the photographs, the memorial cards, all these objects worked to preserve individual identity against death's obliterating force. The child who died might be forgotten within a generation without these material anchors to memory. But the lock of hair in a locket, the photograph on a parlor wall, the memorial ring worn by an aunt, these objects extended remembrance, creating connections across time that otherwise would have dissolved. They transformed abstract memory into concrete form, making the dead tangible in ways that stories and recollections could not match. Yet these practices also created psychological burdens. The constant presence of memorial objects, the daily reminders of death that surrounded Victorian families, contributed to the era's atmosphere of pervasive mortality. You could not escape death when it literally hung around your neck, when it stared at you from photographs on every wall, when your jewelry was fashioned from corpses' remains. The dead inhabited Victorian homes as thoroughly as the living, their presence maintained through elaborate systems of material memory. Children growing up surrounded by these death objects absorbed particular lessons about mortality. They learned that the dead remained present, that physical remains possessed power and significance, that death did not mean complete separation. These lessons shaped their emotional lives and their eventual mourning practices, perpetuating the culture of memorial keepsakes across generations. The line between preservation and obsession sometimes blurred. Some Victorian families accumulated vast collections of memorial objects, their homes becoming virtual shrines to the dead. Rooms were maintained exactly as deceased family members had left them, undisturbed for years or decades. Personal belongings became sacred relics, preserved with religious devotion. These practices suggested an inability or unwillingness to accept death's finality, a retreat into memorial spaces rather than continuing engagement with living world. The commercialization of memorial keepsakes, which we touched on in discussing the mourning industry, created opportunities for both authentic remembrance and exploitative commerce. Hair workers and jewelers understood the emotional vulnerability of bereaved clients, the desperate desire to preserve something of the departed. Some craftspeople approached this work with genuine sensitivity and artistry. Others treated it purely as business, their creations more concerned with profit than memorial significance. The authenticity of hair in memorial jewelry sometimes came into question. Unscrupulous dealers substituted animal hair or hair from unknown humans when clients' supplied hair proved insufficient or difficult to work with. Families might wear memorial jewelry containing strangers' hair or no human hair at all, believing they carried their loved ones' remains while actually wearing substitutes. This potential for deception added another layer of psychological complexity to an already fraught practice. The decline of post-mortem photography and elaborate memorial keepsakes began in the late Victorian period and accelerated into the 20th century. Changing attitudes toward death, improvements in healthcare that reduced mortality rates, and shifting aesthetic preferences all contributed to these practices falling out of favor. Photography of the dead came to seem morbid rather than appropriate. Hair jewelry appeared grotesque rather than sentimental. The elaborate memorial culture seemed excessive and unhealthy. Yet these practices had served real psychological needs for the people who engaged in them. They provided structure for grief, outlets for memorializing impulses, tangible ways to maintain connection with the departed. Their disappearance left gaps that new practices only partially filled. The move away from home death to hospital death, from extended mourning to brief memorial services, from elaborate keepsakes to simple photographs of the living, these changes reflected broader shifts in Western culture's relationship with mortality. The legacy of Victorian memorial practices persists in subtle forms. We still keep photographs of deceased loved ones, though now of them in life rather than in death. We still distribute memorial cards at funerals, though without the elaborate black borders and post-mortem images. We still wear jewelry containing ashes or small amounts of cremated remains, echoing the hair jewelry our Victorian ancestors wore. The impulse to keep physical connections to the dead, to maintain their presence through material objects, continues even as the specific forms have changed. The psychological truth underlying these practices remains constant across time. Humans struggle with death's finality, with the complete disappearance of people we love. We seek ways to hold on to the departed, to preserve something of their presence, to deny or soften the absolute separation that death imposes. The Victorians expressed these universal human needs through elaborate material culture that now seems strange or disturbing. But the needs themselves, for connection, for memory, for tangible links to those we've lost, persist in every era, finding expression through whatever cultural forms are available. The elaborate Victorian funeral practices we have explored throughout this journey did not simply vanish with the turn of the 20th century. They left lasting imprints on how Western cultures understand death, manage grief, and memorialize the departed. The psychological patterns established during the Victorian era, the commodification of mourning, the performance of grief, the material preservation of memory, continue to shape contemporary attitudes toward death, often in ways we fail to recognize. Tonight, as we approach the end of our exploration, we examine how Victorian funeral psychology echoes through modern grief practices and consider what these historical customs reveal about the enduring human struggle with mortality. Imagine yourself at a contemporary funeral, perhaps one you attended recently or can easily envision. Notice the elements that persist from Victorian tradition, the somber clothing, though no longer exclusively or elaborately black. The funeral home, a direct descendant of the Victorian funeral parlor, the carefully composed body in an expensive casket, the prescribed rituals of viewing and service, the flowers, the cards, the careful management of grief's public display. Strip away modern trappings, and the underlying structure remains remarkably Victorian, the same psychology of controlled grief and commodified mourning operating through updated forms. The funeral industry that emerged during the Victorian era established patterns that dominate contemporary death management. The professionalization of death, the transfer of death's physical and emotional labor from families to paid specialists, represents perhaps the Victorians' most lasting contribution to modern death culture. Before the Victorian period, families washed and prepared their own dead, built or procured simple coffins, buried their relatives in churchyards or family plots with minimal professional intervention. Death remained primarily a family affair, managed within kinship networks with community support. The Victorian transformation of death into a professional service created the modern funeral industry with all its psychological and economic implications. Contemporary funeral homes operate according to business models established in the 19th century. They offer packages of services at various price points, guiding bereaved families through decisions about caskets, embalming, transportation, cemetery plots, flowers, and countless other details. The psychological vulnerability of grief that Victorian funeral directors learned to exploit remains central to the industry's operations today. Modern funeral costs echo Victorian patterns of expense and social pressure. A contemporary American funeral averages $7,000 to $10,000, with costs easily reaching $20,000 or more for elaborate services. These expenses consume substantial portions of family savings or create debt, much as Victorian funerals bankrupted working-class families who felt pressured to mourn beyond their means. The psychological mechanisms remain identical. The desire to honor the dead properly, the fear of appearing cheap or uncaring, the social pressure to maintain appropriate standards, the exploitation of grief's vulnerability by an industry selling necessary services at inflated prices. The practice of embalming, which began its commercial development during the Victorian period, became standard procedure in American funeral homes during the 20th century. Embalmers present their work as necessary for viewing and sanitation, as honoring the deceased through preservation and presentation. But embalming serves primarily commercial purposes, extending the period between death and burial, and thus allowing time for elaborate funeral arrangements that generate higher profits. The Victorian impulse to deny death's physical realities through cosmetic intervention and chemical preservation persists in every embalmed body displayed in contemporary funeral homes. The contemporary viewing or visitation echoes Victorian practices of laying out the dead in the front parlor. Modern funeral homes recreate domestic spaces, parlors, sitting rooms, reception areas, attempting to provide home-like comfort while maintaining professional control. The body is displayed much as Victorians displayed their dead, positioned in peaceful repose, hands folded, dressed in fine clothes, surrounded by flowers. Visitors file past the casket, offer condolences to the family, speak in hushed tones, maintain appropriate demeanors. The ritual remains essentially unchanged despite occurring in commercial spaces rather than private homes. The psychological functions of viewing also persist unchanged. Viewing allows confirmation of death, helps mourners accept loss's reality by confronting the physical evidence of the body. It provides closure, a final opportunity to see the deceased before burial, or cremation removes them permanently from view. It creates community, bringing together friends and family to acknowledge death collectively. These functions operated identically in Victorian parlors and operate in contemporary funeral homes. The human needs served by viewing transcending historical and cultural changes. Yet the move from home to funeral home altered death's psychological landscape in significant ways. When death occurred at home and bodies remained there during the mourning period, families maintained intimate contact with their dead. They lived with corpses in adjacent rooms, managed the practical challenges of preservation and presentation, bore direct responsibility for death's physical realities. This forced intimacy, while potentially traumatic, also normalized death, made it a familiar rather than alien presence. The professionalization of death removed these intimate encounters. Bodies are taken quickly to funeral homes, where professionals handle all physical preparations away from family view. The deceased returns to family presence only after transformation into a peaceful, sanitized display that conceals death's harsh realities. Families encounter their dead only in controlled settings, for limited periods, with death's messiness hidden behind cosmetic and chemical interventions. This distancing serves protective purposes, but also contributes to death's alienation, its transformation into something strange and frightening rather than a natural part of life's cycle. Contemporary mourning customs retain Victorian influences, though in attenuated forms. The elaborate mourning wardrobe has largely disappeared, replaced by simple expectation of dark or subdued colors at funerals and for some period afterward. The extended mourning periods with their rigid behavioral restrictions have contracted to brief intervals. Most contemporary mourners return to work within days or weeks, resume normal activities quickly, move through grief without the structural support or restrictions that Victorian mourning provided. This compression of mourning reflects broader cultural changes, faster-paced life, economic pressures that prevent extended absence from work, therapeutic models that emphasize healthy grief as relatively quick acceptance and adjustment rather than prolonged sorrow. But the compression also creates psychological challenges. Without structured mourning periods, without clear guidelines for grief's expression, without community acknowledgement of mourning status, contemporary mourners often struggle to know how to grieve when grief becomes excessive, how to navigate between authentic feeling and social expectation. The Victorian tension between public performance and private suffering persists in contemporary grief. Social media has created new platforms for grief performance, where mourners post about their loss, share memories and photographs, receive condolences and support from wide networks. These posts serve genuine emotional needs. They allow people to process grief through expression, to seek community support, to memorialize the departed publicly. But they also create opportunities for performative grief, for curating sorrow's presentation, for managing death as another aspect of personal branding. The question of grief's authenticity, which troubled Victorian observers, troubles us still. When someone posts elaborate mourning messages on social media but returns quickly to cheerful content, are they performing grief or processing it? When memorial services become celebrations of life focused on joy rather than sorrow, do they honor genuine feeling or deny grief's darkness? Contemporary culture struggles with these questions much as Victorians did, seeking to distinguish authentic emotion from its performance, while recognizing that all grief expression involves elements of both. Memorial practices have evolved, but retain Victorian elements. Contemporary memorial services often include video presentations, compiling photographs of the deceased, creating visual narratives of their lives. These presentations echo Victorian post-mortem photography and memorial cards, serving similar functions of preservation and commemoration through visual media. The photographs show the person in life rather than death, reflecting changed attitudes about appropriate death imagery. But the underlying impulse to create permanent visual records that preserve memory remains constant. The commercialization of memorial products has accelerated beyond Victorian precedents. Online retailers offer vast catalogues of memorial jewelry, custom urns, memory books, tribute videos, memorial websites, and countless other products. The memorial industry, like the funeral industry, exploits grief's vulnerability, marketing products and services to bereaved families who want to honor their dead properly. The Victorian pattern of transforming grief into commerce persists and intensifies in contemporary markets. Therapeutic models of grief have introduced new frameworks for understanding mourning, frameworks that contrast sharply with Victorian approaches. Contemporary psychology emphasizes stages of grief, encourages working through loss, promotes acceptance and adjustment as healthy grief's goals. These models can provide helpful structure, validating grief's difficulty while offering paths toward healing. But they also risk pathologizing grief that deviates from expected patterns, creating new forms of pressure around how people should mourn and how quickly they should recover. The Victorian emphasis on visible grief expression has shifted toward internalized processing. Contemporary culture often treats grief as primarily internal, psychological work rather than external performance. This shift reflects therapeutic influence, changing gender roles, and broader cultural movements toward privacy and emotional control. But the shift also risks isolating mourners, depriving them of community recognition and support that Victorian mourning customs, however restrictive, automatically provided. The death positivity movement, which has gained traction in recent decades, represents partial rejection of Victorian death denial while embracing some Victorian openness about mortality. Death-positive advocates encourage discussing death openly, planning for death actively, accepting death as natural rather than shameful or frightening. They critique the funeral industry's exploitation of grief and the broader culture's death denial. Yet many death-positive practices, home funerals, green burials, community death care, echo pre-Victorian and early Victorian customs, suggesting cyclical patterns in death culture rather than linear progress. Contemporary anxieties about death mirror Victorian fears in many ways. We fear dying alone in institutional settings, much as Victorians feared dying without family present. We fear being forgotten after death. Our digital presence is vanishing without trace, much as Victorians feared being forgotten without proper memorials. We fear death's pain and indignity, loss of control and autonomy, exactly as our Victorian ancestors did. The specific forms of these fears shift with technological and social changes, but the underlying anxieties remain constant across generations. The Victorian construction of the good death persists in contemporary palliative care and hospice philosophy. The good death remains one that occurs peacefully, with pain controlled, surrounded by loved ones, with affairs settled and relationships resolved. Hospice care attempts to create conditions for good deaths, providing medical management, emotional support, and structured environments that facilitate peaceful dying. This represents Victorian death ideals translated into modern medical and psychological frameworks. Yet contemporary dying often deviates from good death ideals, just as Victorian dying did. People die suddenly in accidents, alone in hospital rooms, in pain despite medication, with conflicts unresolved and words unsaid. The gap between idealized death and actual dying experiences creates guilt, regret, and psychological disturbance for survivors, exactly as it did in Victorian families whose loved ones died badly according to the era's standards. Children's exposure to death has changed dramatically since the Victorian period. Contemporary children often reach adolescence without witnessing death firsthand, without attending funerals, without seeing dead bodies. This protection from death exposure aims to shield children from trauma to preserve innocence. But it also creates anxiety and fear around death, making it mysterious and terrifying rather than familiar. Victorian children, despite being exposed to death's harsh realities, developed comfort with mortality that many contemporary adults lack. The question of how much death exposure benefits versus harms children remains unresolved. Some contemporary parents include children in funerals and memorial services, believing that participation helps children understand death and process grief. Others exclude children, considering death too traumatic for young minds. Victorian practices, which included children fully in mourning rituals, offer one model. Contemporary protective approaches offer another. Neither resolves the fundamental challenge of helping children understand mortality while preserving their emotional well-being. The persistence of Victorian funeral psychology reveals something essential about human responses to death. Despite tremendous changes in medicine, technology, religion, and social organization, humans continue struggling with the same fundamental challenges the Victorians faced. We must manage death's physical realities while maintaining respect for the deceased. We must process overwhelming grief while continuing to function in daily life. We must memorialize the departed while accepting their absence. We must balance private suffering with public acknowledgement. We must honor death's significance while preventing it from overwhelming life. The Victorian elaborate response to these challenges, the extensive mourning periods, the professional funeral industry, the memorial photography and keepsakes, the performative grief, represented one cultural solution to universal human problems. Contemporary culture offers different solutions: therapeutic grief processing, abbreviated mourning, professional death management, digital memorialization, but addresses the same underlying needs and anxieties. The psychological manipulation inherent in Victorian funeral culture persists because it exploits unchanging human vulnerabilities. Grief makes us desperate to honor the dead properly, vulnerable to pressure and suggestion, willing to spend beyond our means, eager for structure and guidance. The funeral industry understood these vulnerabilities in the Victorian period and exploits them still, offering expensive services and products that promise to ease grief while actually profiting from it. Yet dismissing all Victorian funeral practices as mere manipulation or morbid excess misses their genuine psychological functions. The mourning wardrobe provided visible identity during grief's disorientation. The extended mourning periods gave time for emotional adjustment. The memorial keepsakes offered tangible comfort. The elaborate rituals created structure when life felt chaotic. These practices served real needs, even as they also enabled exploitation and social control. The legacy of Victorian funeral practices reminds us that death culture serves multiple purposes simultaneously: practical, psychological, social, economic, spiritual. Any death culture must address bodies' physical disposal, survivors' emotional needs, community social functions, commercial opportunities, and existential questions about mortality and meaning. The Victorian system addressed all these elements, creating elaborate frameworks that managed death comprehensively, if not always healthily. Contemporary dissatisfaction with industrial death management, the impersonal funeral homes, the expensive caskets, the embalmed bodies, the brief grieving periods, reflects recognition that current practices serve some needs while neglecting others. The death positivity movement and green burial advocates seek alternatives that honor death without exploitation, that allow genuine grief without performance pressure, that create meaningful memorials without commercial excess. These movements both reject and echo Victorian practices, seeking balance between extremes. The question of how cultures should manage death remains perpetually unresolved. Each generation must negotiate between individual emotional needs and social requirements, between authentic expression and appropriate performance, between honoring the dead and continuing to live. The Victorian solution, with its elaborate rituals and extensive mourning, represented one point on a spectrum of possibilities. Contemporary approaches represent another point. Neither perfectly addresses death's challenges because those challenges are inherent to human mortality itself. As you lie here in the darkness, perhaps drifting towards sleep, consider your own relationship with death and grief. How have Victorian patterns shaped your expectations about funerals and mourning? When you imagine a proper funeral, what elements feel necessary? The viewing, the flowers, the eulogy, the professional funeral home. When you think about how you would mourn a loved one, what feels appropriate? Black clothes, time away from work, avoiding celebrations, maintaining a serious demeanor. These expectations, whether you follow or reject them, likely trace their lineage to Victorian precedents. Consider, too, the material objects you keep as memorials: photographs, inherited jewelry, saved clothing, mementos of various kinds. These objects serve psychological functions similar to Victorian hair jewelry and memorial cards, keeping the departed present through physical remains and meaningful artifacts. The form changes, but the impulse persists across time. The Victorian funeral practices we have explored throughout this long night represent human attempts to control the uncontrollable, to find meaning in mortality, to maintain connection across death's divide. They reveal both the heights of cultural elaboration and the depths of human grief. They demonstrate how societies channel universal emotions into specific practices, how commerce exploits sorrow, how public performance and private suffering intertwine, how the dead continue inhabiting the world of the living through memory, ritual, and material culture. Our journey through Victorian funeral practices comes to its close, the shadows of 19th century mourning parlors fading as we return to the present moment. You have traveled through elaborate death rituals, witnessed grief transformed into performance and commerce, encountered the unsettling intimacy of post-mortem photography and memorial keepsakes, and traced the echoes of Victorian death culture into contemporary practices. The psychology underlying these elaborate Victorian farewells reveals timeless human struggles with mortality and loss. The Victorians' obsession with death emerged from high mortality rates and constant proximity to dying, but it also reflected deeper anxieties about control, memory, social status, and meaning. They constructed elaborate systems attempting to manage death's chaos, to transform raw grief into structured mourning, to create permanence through memorial objects and practices. These systems served multiple purposes, some beneficial and others harmful. They provided structure during overwhelming loss, created community acknowledgement of grief, honored the dead through material and behavioral tribute, and generated substantial commercial profit. They also restricted authentic emotional expression, enforced social hierarchies through mourning's expense, manipulated vulnerable people into excessive spending, and sometimes intensified rather than easing psychological suffering. The Victorian funeral practices we explored tonight were products of their specific historical moment, an era of rapid industrialization, rigid class distinctions, elaborate social codes, high mortality, and changing relationships between public and private life. Yet the psychological patterns underlying these practices transcend their historical context. Humans in every era struggle with death's finality, seek ways to honor and remember the departed, need community support during grief, and remain vulnerable to exploitation of sorrow. Contemporary culture has largely abandoned Victorian mourning's elaborate forms, while retaining many of its underlying structures. We still professionalize death through funeral homes, still spend substantial sums honoring the departed, still struggle with questions of authentic versus performed grief, still seek material objects that preserve memory and connection. The Victorian legacy persists not because we consciously maintain 19th century customs, but because we face similar challenges in managing death and negotiating grief. As sleep approaches, as your mind begins its drift into unconsciousness, let these Victorian shadows fade. The elaborate mourning dresses, the professional weepers, the post-mortem photographs, the hair jewelry, all these strange practices recede into history. What remains is the unchanging human reality. We love, we lose, we grieve, we remember. We seek meaning in mortality and connection beyond death. We honor our departed through whatever cultural forms are available, whether Victorian crepe and jet jewelry or contemporary memorial websites and cremation jewelry. Rest now in the comfort of the present, in your warm bed far removed from Victorian mourning parlors. Death will come to us all eventually, as it came to all those 19th century people whose elaborate funeral practices we have explored. But tonight you live, you breathe, you rest safely. The Victorian obsession with death, their elaborate attempts to control and commemorate mortality, need not disturb your peace. Let the weight of these historical sorrows settle and disperse. Let the darkness become simply darkness, peaceful and restful rather than shadowed by century-old grief. The past is past. The dead are dead, and you, alive in this moment, can release Victorian ghosts to their proper rest and drift peacefully into sleep. Good night.